In the last video that I made on this channel, I reacted to someone called Kyle in Japan, who made a video of his first year of piano progress. And in that video, I talked quite a lot about avoiding just reading the notes and translating them onto the piano. How much of the music does he actually understand compared to just being able to read the notes and play them? But how exactly do you understand a piece of music? How do you read a piece of music and work out exactly how you're supposed to play it? Well, that is exactly what I'm going to explain in today's video, so let's get into it. Now, when you are first looking at a piece of music, there are certain things that you're going to want to try and work out. And this is actually before you even play a single note. And those things are the performance markings, the key signature, the time signature, any abnormalities that are in the music, and the structure of the piece of music. So firstly, performance markings. Now, if you are playing a classical piece of music, a lot of the time you're probably going to get something that's in Italian or in German or French. In more popular music, you might get some English, which is nice. In this video, I'm going to show you using Minuet in F by Mozart. And in this case, we have the word grazioso. If there are any terms in a piece of music that you don't understand, this is a good time to do that before you even start learning the piece, because that will inform you as to the feeling that you're going to try and create. Now, grazioso is a similar word to gracious, and it kind of means nice, sweet. Google says graceful, smooth, and elegant, so that's good to know. A lot of the time at the start of a piece of music, it'll usually be something to do with the speed of the piece of music. So you might see allegro, which means fast, or andante, which is more of a walking pace. Whatever the performance marking tells you is going to tell you something about how you're supposed to play it. In this particular case, we also have another piece of information written into the title, and that is the word minuet. Now, a minuet is actually a type of dance, and it's a type of dance that's kind of similar to a waltz. It has 3 beats in a bar usually. The second thing we need to know before we even start is the key signature of the piece. And in this case, we have 1 flat in the key signature. Now, when there is 1 flat in the key signature, that means that we are in the key of F major or D minor. And that is because F major and D minor are both relatives, so they both actually have the same notes in their scales. And from this key signature, we only know that this piece of music has 1 flat, so it could be F major and it could be D minor. But this does tell us that every time we see a B in the piece of music, then we're going to play it as a B flat instead. The third thing that we need to know is the time signature. Now, the time signature is 3/4, which means there are 3 beats in every bar, which we could have already guessed if you knew what a minuet was and knew that they are a dance that usually has 3 beats in a bar. Once we know the performance markings, the key signature, and the time signature, then we can just have a quick scan through the piece of music for any abnormalities that it's going to be very useful to be aware of. And the most obvious abnormalities is that we can see that there are accidentals written into the piece of music after this repeat mark. Now, an accidental is just a note that changes from the original key signature, so it's any added flats, sharps, or naturals that are written into the piece of music. And whenever you see any accidental in a piece of music, that tells us something about the music. It tells us that we could be in a minor key, because often when you are in a minor key, you'll see some accidentals written throughout the music. Or it could tell us that we're changing key, so we're no longer using the same scale that we were using at the beginning of the piece. And this is something that we can work out when we actually start looking through the piece of music. But for now, it's important to know that in this section of the music, something odd is happening. And then the final thing we want to quickly work out before we actually start playing is the structure of the piece of music. And this means, are there any repeats? Are there clear sections to the music? And in this case, we do have a repeat after the first 8 bars. Then after that repeat, we get these accidentals, which probably make the music sound different. And then in bar 17, we get the theme from the beginning returning again. So this particular piece of music has a very clear A, B, A structure. It starts with the opening theme. It then goes somewhere different with some accidentals, and then it returns back to familiar territory, back to the thing that we started with. Okay, now we can start playing the piece of music and determining exactly how we're going to play it. There are some things to consider when it comes to how you're supposed to play the piece of music. There is things like the shaping of the melody. Does the melody go up? Does it go down? Are the hands going outwards or inwards? There is things like dynamics and how loud you're supposed to play it. Then there is things like articulation. Are you supposed to play the notes short and spiky, so staccato, or are you supposed to play them all really joined up? Are there any repeating sections? And obviously we already know in this piece of music that there are, but how are you going to play them differently the second time compared to the first time? And what in the music tells us that? And then are there any changes of key? Are we changing from one landscape to another landscape? Are we starting using one scale and then moving to use a different scale anywhere else in the piece? However, the best way to start is by working out what the chords are, because they will tell you the tonality. So are you playing something that's major? Are you playing something that's minor? But they will also help show you where the phrases are, so you know where to taper off at the end of a phrase. And they'll help us work out exactly what's happening in that middle section where we get the accidentals. Just a quick interlude from Future Matt to let you know that every week I also produce videos reacting to my subscribers' piano playing for members of the channel. So if you are interested in learning a lot more about music, then feel free to support the channel and become a member for some extra content. Okay, back to the video. So starting with the chords, in this first bar we have an F, we have an A, we have two C's, and in the left hand we have an F and an A. Now this gives us the notes F, A, and C. And this actually makes an F major chord, and this tells us our key really, because 99.9% of the time the first chord that you see in a piece of music is usually chord 1 in the scale. So if it's an F major scale, that's an F major chord. If it was a D minor scale, then it would probably be a D minor chord. The other massive clue to tell us that it's an F major is the fact that it is in the title. It's Minuet in F. But obviously, the title is not always going to tell you the name of the key. So now that we know we're in the key of F and that we're starting on an F major chord, this kind of sets out how these chords are going to relate to each other. The chord that is in bar 2 is the notes D, F, B flat because of the key signature, and B flat, and in the left hand we have two B flats as well. Now this gives us the notes B flat, D, and F, which is actually a B flat chord, and this is chord number 4 in the key of F. And both of these chords are major chords. We have an F major chord, and we have a B flat chord. This means the music is probably going to sound quite bright, because we're in a major key, we're in the key of F major, and we start with two major chords. In bar 3, we have the notes A, C, F, E, and in the left hand, we have a C and a C. Now, the first two beats of this bar make an F chord again. We have the notes F, A, and C, which is chord number 1. The final notes of this bar are the notes C and E. So this is actually a C chord, which is chord number 5. And in the next bar, we have the notes F, C, F in the left hand, and in the right hand, we have an E going to an F. Now this bar has the notes F, C, and E, but the E isn't actually part of the chord. This is something called a suspension. It's a note that doesn't belong to the chord, moving to a note that does belong to the chord. So in this case, we actually have another chord 1. We have an F chord, but it's missing an A. This means at this moment we have a chord 5 going to a chord 1. And this is something called a perfect cadence. And this is very, very important for understanding how to play the piece of music, because a cadence tells us that the phrase is ending. And a perfect cadence is simply the chords 5 going to chord 1. So if we see a perfect cadence like this, where we have chord 5 moving to chord 1 at the end of like a 4-bar section, then this is the phrase ending, and we can taper it off slightly. The other interesting thing here that affects how we play it is the suspension that's written in that final bar, that final E. And in classical music, suspensions are used quite a lot to add a little bit of tension before resolving that tension. Because the E doesn't belong to an F chord, it kind of clashes against that F that's in the left hand. But then it feels resolved when it finally moves to the F. And whenever there is tension in music, you can lean on that tension so that it feels more satisfying when you resolve it. And in classical music specifically, suspensions are usually prepared. So you'll often see the notes being played just before, and in this case you get an E just before that E that's the suspension. Other things to think about is the fact that the right hand is generally moving downwards, and the left hand is generally moving upwards, which means it's closing in. And when something closes in, you're probably going to make it feel smaller as the phrase goes on. So using all that information for the first 4 bars, it's got to sound elegant and smooth, it's got to sound dancey, it's going to sound positive because they're all major chords. The phrase is going to end after 4 bars, and we're going to taper off slightly, and we're going to lean on that suspension that's in the final bar. In this particular period of music, so in the classical period between kind of 17 and 1800, you often get very, very clear phrasing. They're usually in 4-bar phrases, 8-bar phrases, or 16-bar phrases. And where there is one phrase, you often get a responding phrase, like a call and response. And in this case, we get exactly that. We get another set of 4 bars that make the next phrase, and it's almost a response to the first phrase. So in this particular bar, we have the notes C, E, and G. and we have a C in the left hand, and this makes a C chord, the notes C, E, and G. A C chord is chord 5. In the next bar, we have C, F, and A with a C in the left hand, which makes an F chord, and that is chord 1. Now, this particular situation isn't a perfect cadence because the melody is kind of pushing the music onwards. Usually, you will feel where cadences are supposed to be, and they're usually at the end of 4, 8, or 16 bars. Then, for this next section, we have a C chord being outlined, which is the notes C, E, and G, with a C and an E in the left hand. And we actually also get a B flat stuck on the end of that chord, which actually turns this into a C7 chord. Now, whenever you see a 7 chord like this, it usually has to resolve to chord 1, which is exactly what happens here. We have the notes F and A, and this makes chord 1 in F. That's an F chord. Then we finish with yet another suspension, which is a note that doesn't belong to the chord, falling to a note that does belong to the chord. And this chord is C, G, and C, going to a G, and that makes a C chord, just missing the E. And that is chord 5. That means the chords that end this phrase are actually chord 1 going to chord 5, and this is an imperfect cadence. Now, an imperfect cadence usually feels like a comma in the music. It feels like there needs to be something after it. A perfect cadence can feel finished, and it's usually what's used at the end of a piece, whereas chord 1 going to chord 5 is an imperfect cadence, and it feels like it needs to be followed with something else. But once again, because it's a cadence, we can kind of taper off. And interestingly, in this case, the melody in the right hand is actually kind of ascending throughout these 4 bars. The highest note in the first bar is a G, the highest note in the second bar is an A, and the highest note in the third bar is a B flat, so it's kind of going up. But they're all still major chords, so they all still feel quite positive, and there's nothing unusual going on. And we are responding to that first set of 4 bars. So in the first set of 4 bars, we're probably going to close in and make it feel more introverted and taper off at the cadence in bar 3 to 4. And then in the second set of 4 bars, we're probably going to start expanding outwards and taper off at the cadence in bars 7 to 8. But it's all going to feel elegant, smooth, and positive because they're all major chords. Now that we've worked out these first 8 bars, and we know that the structure of the music is an ABA structure, a lot of this information will also apply to the ending of the piece when it comes back. Now, for the next 4 bars, we are indeed changing key, and we know this because of the accidental. When you are in the key of F major, the only notes we're expecting to see are F, G, A, B flat, C, D, and E. Whereas in this case, we have E flats and F sharps being written into the piece of music. Now, this tells me that we're actually moving into the key of G minor, because G minor has the notes G, A, B flat, C, D, E flat, and sometimes an F sharp included in there as well, if you are using the harmonic minor scale. And this is where it becomes really useful to know your scales and how to make all the major and minor scales, because you'll be able to spot which keys you're moving to when you're reading a piece of music. Now, interestingly, because this is moving to G minor, that means we're going to get a more dark, negative section of the piece of music. So far, all of the chords we've had and the key have all been major. It's all felt quite bright and dancey. Whereas this middle section is probably going to feel a little bit darker because we're moving into a minor key. And here we get the notes F sharp, C, A, and E flat, which actually makes an F sharp diminished chord, which as a chord in themselves, diminished chords do sound kind of not positive. Then we go to the G minor chord, which we're expecting, which is G, B flat, and D. So that is now chord 1 because we're in the key of G minor. Then we get D, F sharp, A's, and C's, which actually makes a D7 chord. And that is chord 5 in G minor, leading to chord 1 in G minor. So once again, we get a perfect cadence in the key of G minor. And that tells us that this phrase is now ending. And we also get yet again another suspension where we've got that F sharp that doesn't belong to the chord, going to a note that does belong to the chord. So once again, we can taper off the music, but this time it's going to sound a little bit darker. Interestingly, also in this section, we have a change of dynamic. In the first section, the music generally wants to be mezzo forte, which means moderately loud. In this section, we want to get a little bit quieter. So that's probably going to make it sound a little bit more mysterious. If we were being louder for this section, then it would probably sound a little bit more aggressive because it's a minor key and it would be louder. But because it's a minor key and we're getting quieter, it's going to sound a little bit more tentative, a little bit more scared. Now, the next phrase is actually doing the job of transitioning us back from G minor to F major, and we can see this because if we look to the end of this phrase, we actually get chord 5, which is a C major chord, going to a chord 1, which is an F major chord. And, yet again, we get that suspension, which is that E that doesn't belong to an F major chord, going to an F, which does, and that is clearly a feature of this piece. And for this section, it's marked piano, which means quiet, so we want to get even quieter, and we want to kind of feel like we're turning that corner again, we're almost coming out of the woods back home to familiar ground. And at the end of bar 16, that should feel like we've returned back to something familiar, like we've returned to something positive, back to a major key, and it feels bright again. And that is the end of section B, which is our more mysterious, interesting, travelling section. We've had section A, which is like being at home. Everything's bright, major. We have 2 phrases which taper off at the end of each phrase. It feels smooth, elegant, dancey. We have the middle section, which is much darker and a bit more mysterious. And then we're now going to return home in the third section, which is a return to section A. So as I said, a lot of the things that I mentioned in the first section also apply here. So we don't really need to go through analysing everything. We only really need to analyse anything that is different. And interestingly, at the end of this first phrase, we have a different bass note with a fermata on top of it. And we also have a fermata on the end note here. And a fermata just means you can hold that note sort of for as long as you like. You can kind of pause before you go into the next phrase. Now, this bass note is actually a D, and this changes the chord altogether. We have an F in the right hand, and we have a D in the left hand, and this actually makes a D minor chord, which is chord number 6 in F major. And we are still coming from chord 5 like we did the first time. And this makes something called a deceptive cadence or an interrupted cadence. It feels almost like the D minor is jumping in a place where it doesn't belong. So chord 5 to 1 is a perfect cadence and feels nice and finished. Chord 1 to 5, or it can be 2 to 5 or 4 to 5, is an imperfect cadence, and that feels like a comma, like it needs something to come after it. And chord 5 to 6 is a deceptive cadence or an interrupted cadence, and this feels like the chord 6 is jumping in where it doesn't belong. And it's kind of interesting that it's thrown in at this moment because we're really familiar with the material that we're listening to. It's supposed to sound positive, major, happy. We're still following both the hands going inwards and kind of tapering off towards the end of that cadence. Where we're expecting an F chord, we actually get a D minor chord, which is going to sound kind of odd. It's like the water has been tainted. What was once happy and major and expected is now kind of finishing in a weird, dark way. And then finally, the last 4 bars are, I believe, exactly the same as before, but this time we actually do get the F major chord at the end with the suspension to finally finish the piece with that perfect cadence that we wanted. And so we can drag this out a little bit more because it's the end of the piece, it sounds major, and we have finally returned to where we started with F major. But interestingly, this time it's also marked as forte, which means loud. So this time we can be a bit more expressive and make it sound much more exciting and like we're glad to be home. And this is what the piece sounds like in its entirety, and hopefully now you can look at it with a fresh perspective, kind of understanding how this piece of music has been written and what you're listening for. There is quite a lot involved in really understanding a piece of music, and if you are learning the piano from the beginning, then you're not going to understand everything in the piece of music, and that is absolutely okay. A lot of it can be driven by what you hear when you play it. But in order to learn, I would definitely try and reverse engineer what you're listening to. If something does sound darker, try and work out why it sounds darker. Is it changing to a minor key? Are you playing a minor chord? If it feels like a phrase is ending, are you getting a chord 5 going to a chord 1? The entire point of working out how a piece of music has been written where the phrases are, what the chords are, what scale are being used, how the notes and chords are being mapped onto the piano, whether it's big, whether it's small, is all in aid of telling a story. If you want to see my video reacting to Kyle in Japan's 1 year of piano progress, then head on through and I will see you there.